that you've got two people here who are great-grandchildren of people who are on the Booth escape route. And there's only one other that I met when I was in St. Mary's County in Maryland. I was walking through a church, and a young girl came up to me and grabbed me by the collar and said, "Are you a Mudd?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Are you a descendant of Dr. Samuel Mudd?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I'm a descendant of Jet." And Jet was the one, well, we'll talk more about Jet later, but she was a descendant of the Jet family, J-E-T-T. And she also played a role in the escape of John Wilkes Booth. Well, tonight I'm going to go through and try to do the impossible. And I'm going to try to do it in an hour. And it covers the plot to kidnap Lincoln, because that's how this all originally started. A plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and use him for a bargaining chip to get Confederate soldiers released from prison. Then we have the assassination. It turns to an assassination. And after the assassination, we go on to the escape of Booth and the people corralling all of the others that were involved or might have been involved. And then, of course, the trial and the escape of Booth until he's eventually killed. Dr. Mudd was handled poorly recently. You might know Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly is very popular, and he was a history teacher for 2 years. And he published a book called Killing Lincoln, at which time he calls Mary Surratt and Dr. Mudd the prime conspirators in the Lincoln assassination, which is totally wrong. Then he's making a children's version of this book. I emailed Bill O'Reilly a long email and told him where his book was errant, where his book was wrong, and Bill never answered me, so I don't watch him too much anymore. A number of years ago, in the late 1980s, a book came out called Blood on the Moon. And Blood on the Moon really takes Dr. Mudd to task and says that Dr. Mudd knew it was Booth at his home and that Dr. Mudd helped Booth escape. But the best book written, I think, about the Lincoln assassination totally and about the escape and the eventual capture or killing of John Wilkes Booth is American Brutus by Michael Kaufman, Michael Kaufman, who learned or who got his energy and his desire to study history from my father, Dr. Richard Mudd. And my dad lived to be 102 years old and was sharp, just like Mary Louise, right over here. Was a very, very sharp man to the very end. So today I'm going to try to do the impossible. I have a slide program, and we're going to start out with the plot to kidnap Lincoln. And I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible because I don't want all of you to suffer with a small room with a big crowd. Okay, can we have lights, please?
Barb, is that the switch right here inside the right there on the stairs? It's blue here. That goes forward.
And that goes back. You can handle this. I put a lot of pressure on my wife here. My wife Evelyn is back here, and she is working, and technology is not her foremost.
Thanks, Evelyn.
We start out, obviously, with the 16th President of the United States, who was 56 years old when this was taken in February 1865, several months before he was assassinated. And one very interesting thing about Abraham Lincoln is that he might have had Marfan's disease. Marfan's disease is a genetic disease that people who have this are tall. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall. They have very pronounced cheekbones. They have a high squeaky voice. They have overly large hands and feet. They tend to be stooping and gawking. They also tend to be highly psychic. They also tend to be highly strong. Abraham Lincoln had all of the characteristics of somebody who has Marfan's disease. And what Marfan's disease does is it ages you quickly. If you look at a photograph of Lincoln in 1860, and you look at a photograph here of Lincoln in 1865, he aged greatly during the Civil War. So maybe partly due to the pressure of the war, but many doctors think that he had Marfan's syndrome, that he would have been dead within 2 to 3 years. If he had lived and not been assassinated, would he be as high up in our pantheon of leaders if he had just died a natural death. The very fact that he was assassinated on a Good Friday, on a religious day, just when the war was over, certainly made him into, as my wife talked about, my wife and I talked about it, it made him into a martyr. Next. Okay, this is a test here. You push the top button there, up, right there. Very good, very good. There are more books written about the Lincoln assassination and about the Civil War than any other era in American history. A lot of books written about John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth himself, who is shown right here, was one of the most handsome men at his times. He had a girlfriend. He had a girlfriend in almost every city. He was possibly even had some illegitimate children that we are not positively sure of. But John Wilkes Booth was really a very, very handsome, a very talented person from a very talented family, and many, many books have been written about it. Is that in focus? Yeah. Is that in focus? It's hard for me to tell here. Yeah. Next. Junius Brutus Booth. We can focus this. We can focus this a little bit. Right here, get this in. Are you turning that, Evelyn? Okay.
There.
This is Junius Brutus Booth. This is John Wilkes Booth's father, who, at the age of 25, he was married to a woman in England. He was a very popular actor in England. He had a wife and a child that he ran away from. There was a flower girl in Covent Garden named Mary Ann Holmes. He ran off with her and came to the United States, and after that had 10 children by Mary Ann Holmes. John Wilkes Booth was the 9th child of Mary Ann Holmes and Junius Brutus Booth. And John Wilkes Booth grew up in a household that was a strange household. To give you an example of how strange that might be, Junius Brutus Booth believed in reincarnation. He believed that every living thing was reborn, and it could be reborn in like a pigeon could be a former human being. So there was a group of passenger pigeons that had been killed or died. He went to the Unitarian minister and had the pigeons, he bought a cemetery plot, and he had a religious service for the pigeons and buried them in the cemetery plot. Well, that's not a normal human behavior. And Junius Brutus Booth was also an alcoholic, and many of his performances were poor because of his alcoholism. So John Wilkes Booth grew up in a rather strange family, a very strange but a very talented family, because Junius Brutus Booth, when he wasn't into his liquor, was a marvelous, marvelous tragedian. Next. And one of the big mysteries, there's a lot of mysteries in the Lincoln assassination, and one of the mysteries that my father wanted to really look into was, did John Wilkes Booth escape? Was the body that they brought back to Washington, was that John Wilkes Booth's body? Or did they substitute another body? My father was one of the ones, along with some others, who wanted to dig up Booth's grave and find out whether it really was John Wilkes Booth buried in that grave. Here's a book, Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. A number of people think that John Wilkes Booth did not get John Wilkes Booth, that he did escape, and that he lived on elsewhere. As a matter of fact, there was one woman who called me from Samoa. She was the daughter of the king of Samoa. And she said that John Wilkes Booth made it all the way to Samoa and married a Samoan girl and died in Samoa. So there is some controversy. Is it possible that they substituted a body for John Wilkes Booth? Next. This is the Booth home in Bel Air, Maryland, which is about 30 or 40 miles northeast of Baltimore, Maryland. And it's a wonderful thing because this home was going to be destroyed. It was owned by a college, and they figured they didn't want to spend the money to fix it up. But then a private family moved in, restored the home, and then at certain times of the year, they allowed people to go through the home. And this is where John Wilkes Booth grew up. in Bel Air. They would stay here during the warm months, and during the cold months, they would go to Baltimore. Next. This is the interior of this home, of Booth's home near Bel Air. And today they've tried to make the home look pretty much as it was in 1865 when the Booth family was there. Next. And this is John Wilkes Booth, like a lot of errant young boys, scratched his initials into the window of his bedroom. So it's a little hard, but you have to see that there is a J. Wilkes Booth in there. And John Wilkes Booth, when he grew up, he was a sensitive boy, but he grew up like a lot of other boys. He played around in the woods. He liked nature. He was very close to his sister Asia. John Wilkes Booth grew up in a family of actors. Both his brother Edwin, his brother Joseph, his brother Junius, all of them were at one time actors, and Edwin was one of the great actors of his time. Next. This is my great-grandfather, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd, after he got out of prison, after spending 4 years in prison. He would have been about 36 or 37 years of age when this photograph was taken. Dr. Mudd had gone to a prep school. After prep school, he went to the University of Maryland. Actually, he went to Georgetown University first. Then he went on to Baltimore Medical College, which later became the University of Maryland. He could speak 3 languages, and not including Latin. Latin, French, and one other language. He played the violin, played the piano. He was a fine horseman. He was a fine shot. He was typical of the plantation class of people who were highly educated and also very athletic and very talented in many different ways. At the time of the assassination, Dr. Mudd had married his childhood sweetheart. Her name was Dyer. She was kind of lived not too far from where Dr. Mudd was. And they were just childhood friends that got married. And if you lived in Charles County, you married somebody from Charles County in those days. So as a matter of fact, that's why you had a lot of families where you had intermarriage in the family, because everybody was kind of interrelated in a county. So Dr. Mudd married his childhood sweetheart, and he had 4 young children by the time of the assassination. Everybody else involved in this assassination, with the exception of Mary Surratt, were really unconnected. Dr. Mudd had a lot of responsibilities, not only being a doctor, but also being a planter. And tobacco planting is a very intense, difficult job. It requires a lot of hand labor. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, Dr. Mudd no longer had slaves to help him. Remember, when Ed Steers in his book Blood on the Moon says, "Oh my heavens, Dr. Mudd was a Southern sympathizer." Oh, duh. So was Garrett a Southern sympathizer, because they lived in the South. Southern Maryland was as south as you can get, and it's still as south as you can get. So that's kind of a ridiculous statement to say that Dr. Mudd was a Southern sympathizer. Yes, he was a slave owner, and his father was a very wealthy slave owner. And of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was done away with. Well, you say slavery is a horrible thing, but don't forget, these people grew up with that system. And that was part of their economic system. Slavery was ingrained in their whole system. As soon as Abraham Lincoln did a wonderful thing, it had to be done eventually, but it had to be done during wartime, made it more difficult. Most of your wealth was in slaves. Now, I know it's a horrible thing to think that people are worth money, but slaves were worth a great deal of money. And when the Emancipation Proclamation came out, planters were stripped of their wealth. It was a tough time for them. Let's go on to the next. And now we get into the kidnap plot. This is John Surratt, the son of Mary Surratt. He was about 20 years old, 21 years old. He was a courier, a Confederate courier, during the Civil War. He was tall, kind of sandy-haired, and of all the people that Booth enlisted in the plot, first to kidnap and then to kill the president, he was the most intelligent. He was the most sharp. But you know, he's the one who was responsible, I think, for the death, for the hanging of his mother, the first woman ever executed by the federal government, because he didn't show, he ran away, and we'll get into that later. But this young man, who was part of the kidnap plot, backed out, or was not around when kidnapping turned to murder at the very last moment. Next. And this is the most unfortunate woman. Now, I always think Dr. Mudd got a raw deal. Dr. Mudd was highly responsible for them chasing Booth down. But this woman, who was in her early 40s, a highly religious woman, a Catholic, she had one son who was a Confederate soldier. She had a daughter, Anna, and she had John. But her husband was an alcoholic, and he died in 1862. She was left with the family and with huge debts. So she had a tavern. She had a tavern in Maryland. She left that tavern to a policeman, a former policeman named Lloyd, L-L-O-Y-D, John Lloyd. And she came into town, and as part of her debt resolution, she was given a house in Washington that she turned into a boarding house. Unfortunately for her, because her son was involved with the Confederate courier, and because he's going to be enlisted in the kidnap plot, and because the other people involved in that plot stayed at her home, this poor unfortunate woman is going to end up swinging from the end of a rope. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But this is, I think, one of the most unfortunate people in the whole Lincoln assassination. Next. This is the tavern that the Surratts had until 1862, when it was turned over to John Lloyd. Today, this is a very popular tourist location, and as is the Dr. Sam Mudd home. The Dr. Sam Mudd home has been completely restored to look as it did in 1865, and so the Surratt Tavern and the Dr. Sam Mudd home, this tavern would be about 13 miles south of Washington. The Dr. Mudd home is about 30 miles south of Washington. Next. And this is David E. Harold. And here's another kind of an unfortunate story. David E. Harold was in his early 20s. His father had died. He had a mother and 7 sisters. And the sisters kind of either doted over him, or they were always kind of heckling him and making life miserable for their one brother. Davy Harold was a pharmacist clerk. He was also a hunter. He would go out into southern Maryland and hunt for grouse and things of that nature. He knew all the trails and the roads. And his misfortune was that he went to a play where John Wilkes Booth was starring in a play. And after the play, John Wilkes Booth, who kind of hobnobbed around with lowlifes, with barflies and such, after the play was over, Davy Harold went up and wanted to meet John Wilkes Booth, and John Wilkes Booth gave him some tickets to another performance, and remembered this young man who knew the roadways and the riverways in southern Maryland, so he would be valuable when they got President Lincoln and took him through southern Maryland. They would know which way to go because of Davy Harold. Well, it's going to cost him his life. Next. And you might have to bring this down a little bit. Maybe you can't. Looks like we're going to have to take off Lewis Payne. Okay, there's Lewis Payne. Now, here's a mysterious guy. We know that he was a Confederate soldier. We know that he was captured at Gettysburg. After the Battle of Gettysburg, he was shot in the hand, and after that, instead of just putting him in a camp, he turned into a Union nurse. There were lots of battlefield casualties and people injured at Gettysburg, in addition to being killed. So he became a nurse. Later on, he escaped from the Union Army, and he joined Mosby's Rangers for a while. And how he ever came into contact with Booth, we don't know. But Booth needed somebody. He needed a person with muscle. And he was unusual for his time. He was 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. You didn't find people of that stature back in 1865. He was a big guy, and he was a muscled guy. John Wilkes Booth needed somebody like that. A little dim-witted, not too smart, but very strong. His father, unfortunately, if you've ever read about, the gunslingers in Western history in America, why are so many gunslingers sons of preachers? Well, he was the son of a Baptist preacher. And you're going to find that he's also going to swing from a rope. And but he did something that even John Wilkes Booth made John Wilkes Booth cringe, and we'll get into that a little later. This was Lewis Payne, who had an alias of Powell, Lewis Powell. Next. But you're also going to find out that he is a person who did something on his last, before he swung from that rope, he did something that was exceptional. Here's another unfortunate person, Atzerodt, a German immigrant and a carriage painter and a carriage maker in a little town called Port Tobacco in southern Maryland. He was important because he used to take people across the Potomac River in a boat. And you had Union gunboats going back and forth on the Potomac River trying to keep couriers and people carrying contraband from crossing the Potomac. Well, he was one of the guys who knew where the boats were, and he knew what routes and when to go across the river to keep away from Union gunboats. So he was an important person, but like a lot of people, he was a little bit of a misfit because he was a heavy drinker. He didn't bathe. He wore a coonskin cap much of the time. He was a real, if you talk about a lowlife, well, Atzerodt was a lowlife, but he was a valuable asset to the kidnap plot because of his ability to get people across the Potomac River. Next. And this was a childhood friend. This is Arnold. This is Samuel Arnold, who was a boyhood friend of John Wilkes Booth, and he is enlisted in the kidnap plot early. And a very good-looking guy, a pretty sensible guy, because he's going to back out of that kidnap plot at a certain point, which I'll tell you about. And he was also a Confederate private. He was a private in the Confederate Army. And let's go to the next one. And this is Michael O'Loughlin. There he is. He's still around here somewhere. Okay, there he is.
I have to adjust this. I have to hold it.
Okay, Michael O'Loughlin was another boyhood friend of John Wilkes Booth when he lived in Baltimore. And Michael O'Loughlin wore loud clothes, also was a heavy drinker. You know, consumption of alcohol was pretty prodigious during this time. That's why you had a temperance movement, a big temperance movement. As a matter of fact, it was not unusual for John Wilkes Booth to drink a quart of brandy. A quart of brandy. That's a lot of brandy to drink. At this particular time, excessive drinking was a real big problem in our country. And O'Loughlin was one of those, a dandy, a dresser who spent too much time in bars. But being a boyhood friend of Booth's, he was talked into the kidnap plot. Well, both of them, Arnold and O'Loughlin, are going to back out when John Wilkes Booth came in one day and said, well, here's what we're going to do, guys. What we'll do is Lincoln will go to a play, and one of you will shut off the gas lights. And what we'll do is we'll tackle Lincoln, and we'll tie him up, and then we'll put him over the balcony or the whatever they got there, or the railing, over the railing, to the stage, and then we'll drag him across the stage, and we'll go out the back door, and then we'll put him in this wagon, and we'll go away. Well, Arnold and O'Loughlin looked at Booth and said, we're out of this. we're not going to be here. So that was just one of the crazy things that Booth had on his mind is, first of all, President Lincoln was a powerful man. He could have had Marfan's disease, but he was still a strong, tall, powerful, big guy. And to think that you're going to take Abraham Lincoln, he's going to say, that he's just going to let him tie him up like that? No way. That's not going to happen. Okay, next. Okay, now, this is where Dr. Mudd comes into the picture. It's November 1864. John Wilkes Booth has been at the home of Dr. William Queen. He has a letter of introduction to Dr. William Queen, who was a Confederate sympathizer in a Confederate sympathizer area. So Dr. Mudd went to church on one Sunday in Bryantown, which was 5 miles south of his home. And while he was there, he was introduced by the son-in-law of Dr. Queen to John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth was telling everybody that he wanted to buy land in southern Maryland, and that he also wanted to buy a horse. And Dr. Mudd said, well, you know, I think my neighbor's got a horse, and you might be interested in that horse. Remember, during the Civil War, horses became very valuable. If you've ever seen a battle scene after a battle in the Civil War, you see human bodies, but what other kind of bodies do you see? Horses. And horses were targets during battles. Horses, because horses were so important for pulling wagons, for cavalry, or for whatever reason, horses were mobility. So in a battle, targeting horses was really very important. So horses got more and more valuable as the Civil War went on. So here they are at a Catholic church, St. Mary's Church in Bryantown, Maryland. Dr. Mudd is introduced to Booth. He tells Booth that his George Gardner, his neighbor and a relative, has an older, one-eyed horse, because the horse is blind in one eye, but it's a good mover, strong horse. Later in the day, John Wilkes Booth comes by Dr. Mudd's house. They go over, they purchase the horse, and since it's late in the day and you don't have hotels or motels, and you got Southern hospitality, Dr. Mudd said, look, stay at our house. They went to the Dr. Mudd house. They had cigars and sat in the parlor for a while. They went to bed. The next morning, Dr. Mudd and Booth went into Bryantown. They had the horse shod. They got a saddle, and Booth went back to Washington. So did Dr. Mudd, had he met John Wilkes Booth? Yes, he had. The books that I was telling you about, especially Blood on the Moon, said that there was another meeting between Mudd and Booth just before the meeting in Washington, because there was another time that Dr. Mudd met Booth, and that was on December 23rd when he went into Washington to buy a stove for his wife for Christmas. And while he was walking on Washington, remember there aren't as many people in those days. Washington was a relatively small, kind of a hick town. Well, small town, not a hick town, but a small town. And Dr. Mudd's walking down the sidewalk. Booth comes up and says, "Hi, Dr. Mudd, can you introduce John Surratt to me?" And Dr. Mudd said, "Well, John Surratt doesn't live here. They're in the Surratt Tavern." He didn't know that the Surratts had moved into town. At that time, Weichman, a man named Weichman, and Surratt are walking down the sidewalk. They do meet. Booth does meet John Surratt. He gets an introduction from Dr. Mudd to John Surratt. They go upstairs. Booth said, "Let's go upstairs and have milk punches and cigars," which is typical for guys at that time. They went up for 20 minutes, 25 minutes. They had cigars and punches, and that was the last time Dr. Mudd saw John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth does interest Surratt into the kidnap plot, but only after many weeks did he finally get Surratt, who thought that John Wilkes Booth was a government detective. You have to remember at this time, there was a lot of suspicion. Washington itself was more southern than northern. Washington was a southern town surrounded by southern people. It was surrounded by Maryland. And it was a very much of a southern culture. As a matter of fact, Washington still has a lot of those southern properties. People forget that where the location of Washington was so important. Next. This is the inauguration of Lincoln in 1864 on March 5th. Many people think that this was Booth up here, and yes, it was. Booth was up here. He had armed himself that day with a Derringer. It's thought that Booth was hunting for an opportunity to kill Lincoln at that point, but I don't believe that. That's just conjecture on some historians' part. But this is where Lincoln really offered a very magnanimous picture for the future. This is where he made just a wonderful, wonderful speech about bringing the country together. And obviously, Booth wasn't listening. Booth wasn't listening to this because in Booth's mind, maybe a deranged mind, he thought of Abraham Lincoln as being a tyrant. And that being a tyrant came from during the war when habeas corpus was done away with. In other words, there were a lot of illegalities on the part of the Lincoln administration during the war. And I can see why. You're trying to keep a country together. You're trying to fight a civil war is maybe the worst type of war. But many of the things that Abraham Lincoln and his administration did during the war were illegal and tyrannical. And Booth knew it. And John Wilkes Booth, the thing is, it magnified in his mind the fact that other people involved here, Harold, Surratt, Payne, that these people were there. That's not true. That was all conjecture, and that didn't work out. Next. There is only one time when the kidnap plot was attempted. Well, even before the kidnap plot, in 1862, somebody tried to assassinate President Lincoln. He was going to the Soldiers' Home, which is about 3 miles north of Washington. That's where you went, to get away from the smells of Washington. Remember, you had open sewers in those days. You didn't have proper sewers. And if you've ever been in Washington D.C. during the summer, it's hot, it's sticky, and at that time it was smelly. And when it rained, you had like 3 feet of mud on the roads. I mean, cities were not very comfortable places to be during that time. So often Lincoln would, by himself, would ride out to the Soldiers' Home just to get away. And somebody tried to shoot Lincoln, and the bullet went right through his top hat. So it came very close to assassinating Lincoln in 1862. But the only time the kidnap plot was tried is that John Wilkes Booth heard that Lincoln was going to Campbell Hospital, which was near here, near this Soldiers' Home, where you had convalescing Union soldiers, and they were going to put on a play. Some of the people from Ford's Theater were going to put on a play at Campbell Hospital. Abraham Lincoln was supposed to be there. So John Wilkes Booth got his group together, and they all waited, and they waited till the carriage came around the corner, and Booth and Payne were riding down the road looking into the coach, and who was in there but the head of the Supreme Court, Chase. Lincoln wasn't there. So the only time they tried the kidnap plot, it was a total failure because Lincoln was at the National Hotel where Booth was staying. And there was a regiment that had captured a Confederate flag, and that outfit was going to march down the street, so they wanted Lincoln there for that review. So it's kind of ironic that the only time they tried the kidnap plot, Lincoln was at Booth's hotel, standing in front of the hotel, as these Union soldiers marched by because they had captured a Confederate flag in battle. Next. Now this is the route that Booth would have taken in the kidnap plot. Here's Washington, and here is a bridge, the Navy Yard Bridge. It's
sorry about that. I try to hold it.
People have been fired for less.
You don't care, do you?
Right here is Washington. Here is the route. You go across the Navy Yard Bridge, and here is the speed route that goes past Port Tobacco. They get a boat, they cross the Potomac, they hustle here through Virginia, they cross the Rappahannock River, they go to Bowling Green, and then they go down to Richmond, and they've got the President of the United States, and they're going to go as fast as they possibly can. But because John Wilkes Booth is going to break his leg in the jumping across the balcony after he shoots the President, instead, he has to detour. Instead of going the fast route, he has to go this route, past TV. He's got to go to Dr. Mudd's. He gets lost in the swamp. Goes to, later we'll find out where he goes after that. So that's the last thing Booth wanted to do. Now, if Booth hadn't broken his leg, I wouldn't be here. If Booth hadn't broken his leg, she wouldn't be important because Booth would have gotten away. If Booth hadn't broken his leg, chances are he would have been on that fast route. We would have never had the Garretts involved. We would have never had the Mudds involved. Next. It's April 9th, 1865, and this is Chancellorsville, and of course this is where General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. It was a momentous day. Essentially, the war was over. There were still some Confederate forces in the field out west. Union, I think Johnson, one of the Confederate generals, was still active in North Carolina, but the war was over. The war was over. There was no threat to Washington at this particular time, and General Grant was very magnanimous. He was very merciful to the Confederates. He allowed them to take their horses home, their sidearms home, so that they could go hunting. And so we are here, and that's the important thing here, is that Lincoln wanted to treat the South with mercy. And the very fact that he becomes assassinated is going to change the way that the South is handled. And it's really going to change the history of our country in a very dire way. Next. Here we see General Lee and his horse traveler leaving the McLean mansion. Wouldn't call it a mansion, the McLean home, which is there at Appomattox Courthouse. Next. Okay, now this is after April 9th. This is after the surrender. We don't know when John Wilkes Booth said to himself, the kidnap plot's not going to work now because Confederate soldiers are going to be released from prison. So that was the whole idea for kidnapping Lincoln, was to use him as a bargaining chip. Well, forget that plan. That plan's done. So John Wilkes Booth at this time, between April 9th and April 14th, decides to assassinate President Lincoln. And not only President Lincoln, but he wants to also do in Andrew Johnson, the Vice President, and Seward, the Secretary of State. And he is going to task his muscle man to take care of Seward. Now you'll notice, if you look here, I don't know, I can't tell whether that's really in focus. Is that in pretty good focus?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You'll notice the way he's looking right here. By the way, this isn't his body. It's another body. They had pictures at that time. You could stand up and you could use your head and superimpose the head on another body. The other thing is that Secretary of State Seward was mauled so badly by Payne. Payne went to his house. He was fortunate. He was fortunate because a week or so before, his carriage ran away with him. And in order to save his life, he jumped out of the carriage, broke his jaw in 2 places, broke his shoulder, and badly mangled his body. So he was at home in a body cast. He had a body cast here, like this. He had a cast on his shoulder. He's laying in bed in great pain, being taken care of by Fanny, his daughter, and his 2 sons. When Payne breaks into the house with a revolver, goes upstairs pretending that he's got medicines for the Secretary of State, meets one of the sons, tries to shoot the son. The gun doesn't fire, so he takes the gun, turns it around, and smashes his skull in. Then he takes out a Bowie knife, stabs the other son, then goes into the room, stabs the male nurse, a Union soldier who was convalescing, stabbed him, went up to Seward's bed, took the knife, and plunged it repeatedly into Seward. Seward was lucky because he had the cast on. And the cast deflected a lot of the wounds that would have killed him. But it did lay open the side of his face was about a 6-inch rip on the side of his face where his tongue, you could see his tongue in the inside of his mouth. So it was a horrible, horrible injury that bled a lot, but thanks to his carriage accident, he survived. That's why he's looking this direction, because if you looked at the other direction, his face was all disfigured. Next. Now, he's going to do away with Seward. Now, Atzerodt is supposed to do away with Vice President Johnson. But Vice President Johnson doesn't cooperate. He doesn't go to Kirkwood House like he's supposed to and get assassinated. And Atzerodt, the carriage painter, the guy with the coonskin cap that doesn't take a bath and drinks too much, Atzerodt decided that he didn't want to kill the vice president anyhow, so he went out and got drunk. So a lot of people, Steers in his book said that Booth put together his crack outfit. Well, there ain't nothing crack about the outfit that he put together. So here we have Ford's Theater. Anybody in here been to Ford's Theater? Oh, we got some people that have been to Ford's Theater. Ford's Theater was formerly a Baptist church. And in 1862, it was turned into a theater. John Wilkes Booth had performed here, and on the night that the Lincoln was assassinated, that was Our American Cousin, a farcical play. Booth had acted in that play, so he knew where the laugh lines were in Our American Cousin, with Laura Keene, a very popular but aging actress at the time. John Wilkes Booth, he went there to get his mail. He thought that Lincoln was going to go to the Grover's Theater, and he thought that Lincoln was going to have Grant with him. That's another thing. If Mary Lincoln, his wife, wasn't such a, I hate to use the word. No, I'm not going to use that word here. We have young people here. But she was extremely jealous of any other women. Mary Todd Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln went to City Point late in the war, unfortunately, his wife went with him. She scared the daylights out of the other women. Mrs. Grant had the temerity to sit down in the presence of the president. And she ripped up Mrs. Grant, Julia Grant, for that. You don't sit down in the presence of my husband. Then there was another woman there that she also dressed down because she was near her husband, and she was actually with her husband with nobody else around. You don't do that. So Mary Todd Lincoln was first of all, she had a great shoe collection. She had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pairs of shoes. She also was driving her husband into poverty, but by her all the stuff that she purchased. And yet, Mrs. Lincoln and her husband got along quite well. I mean, they were a good couple that could obviously, with their defects, were really bonded well. But what happened was that General Grant, who was supposed to go to the theater with Booth, with Lincoln that night, his wife said, "We're not going to the theater with that woman." And I was going to say that again. I still stop right there. I'm not going to the theater with that woman. So if Grant had gone to the theater with Lincoln, and you know, if you read history, how many times are there ifs? Yes. If it wasn't for Mary Todd Lincoln going to City Point and making Julia Grant mad, Grant would have gone to the theater with Lincoln. He would have had his aide-de-camp with him. Ain't no way John Wilkes Booth was going to get into that booth and shoot the president. That would knock it right there. He most likely would have had 2 or 3 of his aides there. They were not going to get into that booth. So it's just one of those things where jealousy, simple jealousy, led to this tremendous change in American history. So John Wilkes Booth finds out that the president is going to be not at Grover's, but he's going to be at Ford's. So he goes there and he sets up. He makes sure that he can jimmy the door shut once he goes through. He prepares for this. Next. This is a picture of the theater. None of this is original. They rebuilt the inside of how many... Let's see, the Ford's Theater. If you've been in Ford's Theater, you know you walk in there and it looks exactly like it did in 1865, but there's not one stick of originality in the whole theater. All of this has been rebuilt, but it's been really done well. For those of you who are in there, it's amazing what they did. This is called the dress circle. Here is the door that Booth is going to go through to get to the booth, get to the this area right here, where the president is going to be with his wife and their 2 guests. This is where Parker should have been. The Metropolitan Policeman was supposed to be protecting the president. Forbes, his footman, should have been here, along with Parker. Instead, they went to the tavern next door to get drinks. So, John Wilkes Booth is going to enter here. This is called the orchestra down here at the bottom, and this is called the family circle up here. You could put almost 2,000 people in that little theater. They really packed them in there. Next. Here's Mary Todd Lincoln. Yeah, she led a very tough life. She's pretty much like Mrs. Kennedy, who was right by her husband when he was assassinated. Her son eventually committed her to an insane asylum after the war. She gets out of the insane asylum, but very sad life. In 1862, one of her sons died. The other son is going to die. Tad's going to die. I mean, she had a tough time. She had a rough life. She's also, if you ever read a book about Mary Todd Lincoln, she's also a very interesting person to read about. Next. Here's the chair. This is not the chair that the president was assassinated in. That chair is at Greenfield Village. And you'll see some what looks like blood on the back of it. That's not true, because after the Lincoln was shot, he slumped forward. He never bled onto the chair. Somebody put chicken blood on there for, to make it a little more dramatic. The president was sitting here. Mary Todd Lincoln was sitting here. And a major who, they tried to have 12 different people were asked to go to the theater with Lincoln that night, and they all refused. Nobody wanted to go to the theater that night. It was Good Friday. It was a religious holiday. A lot of people were out partying. They were out partying, and they didn't want to go see the same old play that's been shown a number of times. So he finally gets a young major and his girlfriend to come. And they're sitting over here. Next. Here is the John Wilkes Booth with the Derringer, a 44 caliber Derringer. Now that shoots a ball that's almost a half-inch diameter. The Derringer company was in Philadelphia. It's a 6-inch gun, and John Wilkes Booth was a remarkable marksman. He could shoot across, he could take a gun and shoot this way, he could shoot under his arm. He was very good with the pistol. But it doesn't take a great shot to come up from behind on somebody and shoot him in the head. A terrifically cowardly act. Here is Major Rathbone, here's Clara Harris, and as often happens when you have a tragic event, the tragedy doesn't stop there. If this Major Rathbone had taken Booth down, after he saw Booth shoot the president, if he had done what any good major should have done, he should have tackled Booth. He should have gone right at him, wrapped his arms around him, and taken him down to the floor. Instead, he said, struggling like this, Booth had a Bowie knife and took that knife and ripped his arm open. But if he had done what he should have done, he would have tackled him and taken him down. If he had held him for only a little bit, Booth never would have gotten out. He would have never made it across that railing and across the stage. It's another if. It's another if. Well, here's what happens. Rathbone marries this girl. And after he marries this girl, he's stationed in Germany in 1894, and it's Christmas Eve, and his wife is trimming the tree, and he takes out a pistol, and he shot his wife and killed her. And he ended his life in an insane asylum. He never forgave himself for not taking Booth down. He never forgot that, and it bothered him so much that he was a very disturbed man. So tragedy to tragedy to tragedy. Next. Booth wore 2 spurs. If he hadn't worn those spurs, Mary wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here. Because after he shot the president, and by the way, he shot the president, it's interesting because the president was looking down at the stage. He was leaning over and he was looking this way. And looking down at the stage. When Booth came behind him, Lincoln recognized something was wrong. And at that point, Lincoln turned his head this way because he figured somebody was coming after him. At that point, Booth shot him behind the left ear, and that half-inch ball transited his head, stopped behind his right eye, and split his skull right down here, the pressure of the ball going through the skull. The amazing thing is that the president lived as long as he did after being shot that way. If John Wilkes Booth hadn't been wearing spurs, the spur would not have caught in one of the flags that was draped across the box. It's a 12-foot jump is easy for a Shakespearean actor. John Wilkes Booth was a remarkable actor. 12-foot jump is nothing. But because his spur caught in that flag, in the Treasury Guard's flag, it made him land on his left leg, and that's when he broke that small bone in the front of the leg, the fibula, and that's why she is here, and that's why I am here. Next. Booth runs across the stage, yells, Sic semper tyrannis, death also to traitors. A lot of people at this time thought it was part of the play. They were clapping and everything else until they heard the shouts and screams from the box up here, and at that particular point, pandemonium, absolute pandemonium in the theater. John Wilkes Booth, as he goes out, the band leader is in his way, so he takes a knife out and stabs him in the back on the way out. And next, as he goes out, here's Peanuts Burrow. They called him Peanuts because he used to sell peanuts before he became a handyman at the theater. He was holding Booth's horse. Booth got on his horse and he rode out Baptist Alley and clattered out of Washington. Next. Here's Baptist Alley at a nighttime shot, and this is behind the theater. Booth is going to clatter down here, and he's going to take a left right here and get out of Dodge. Next. Now, this is the modern bridge where the Navy Yard Bridge was located that crossed the Anacostia River. Back in 1865, it was a very low, one of these little low wooden bridges, kind of like on pontoons. And there was a guard there, and the guard was not supposed to let anybody go across the bridge. Well, John Wilkes Booth rides up to that bridge, and even though they're not supposed to let anybody pass, he says, "Hi, I'm John Wilkes Booth." He actually used his name, "Hi," because I think at that particular point, he was really high on this thing. He said, "Wow, man, I assassinated the President of the United States. Of course, my foot hurts a little, my leg hurts a little bit, but wow, this is really great." And of course, he's been drinking all day. He's been drinking brandy, beer, everything else all day. So he's really pumped up. Wow, I killed this great traitor to our country, etc., etc. So he even uses his own real name. "Hi, I'm John Wilkes Booth." He crosses that bridge, and not long after, Harold, who was supposed to be helping Payne, but Harold got scared silly when he heard all the screams coming from Seward's house as Seward was stabbing and hitting people over the head and doing all the horrible things inside the Seward home. Harold said, "Man, I'm getting out of here." So Harold left. Later on, Harold takes his horse and he crosses the Anacostia River at the same point, saying that he had been to a bordello that evening and he had to get home a little late, and could you please let him across? So they did let both Booth and Harold get across the Navy Yard Bridge and go into southern Maryland next. I won't go into the last hours of President Abraham Lincoln. He was shot at 10:15. By 10:45, he was across the street in the Peterson home. Peterson was a tailor. And they took him to a room in the back of the house. And if you go to the Peterson house today, it looks just like this. This is the same bed that the president was in. And ironically, John Wilkes Booth had rested in this very same bed when he came to Washington at a previous time. Goes to show another strange things that happened. The bed was so short that they had to move the bed away from the wall and put Lincoln angled on the bed because he was 6 feet 4 inches tall, and the average man at that time was 5'6". And there were 16 doctors who eventually came into the room between 10:45 and 7:22 when the president died, and up to 90 people came into that room while the president was dying. And again, it's amazing that the president lasted as long as he did. He was at least his ability, his stamina to survive was very strong. Next. This is the Surratt Tavern. Okay, John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold got together. They go to the Surratt Tavern, and at the Surratt Tavern, they get some whiskey. They get a bottle of whiskey, and they're knocking back some whiskey. They also pick up a carbine, some field glasses, and they tell John Lloyd, who's drunk. You know, I hate to keep saying all this stuff, but there are a lot of drunk people involved in this situation. John Lloyd, the former Washington, D.C. policeman, had been drinking all day long. They had to wake him up so that they could get the carbine, the field glasses, and the whiskey. And he tells Lloyd, he said, before they left, I think we have assassinated the president and the Secretary of State, Seward. And funny that he does not mention the fact that the vice president was supposed to be killed too. So I don't know why Booth didn't mention that fact too, because he could not have known that Atzerodt went out and got drunk instead of shooting the vice president. So here they are at the tavern, and now, at this particular time, it's raining, there's a half moon, there's some moonlight, it's a kind of a drizzly night. John Wilkes Booth realizes, hey, I can't take that fast route into southern Maryland. I'm going to have to go and see a doctor, because he was really feeling the pain. It wouldn't be bad, but you don't ride a horse with a broken leg, because every time that horse hits, that bone is being affected. So he remembered Dr. Mudd, and he went to Dr. Mudd, and he got the next... this is my dad, Dr. Richard Mudd. By the way, my dad gave talk like this hundreds and hundreds of times all over the country and beyond. So I'm kind of carrying on from my father here. This is my dad looking at the floor joists where the weapons, where the carbines and the field glasses and a rope and a wrench were kept. Next, and this is at the Surratt Tavern. Booth and Harold come to a place called TB. It's a little town, TB. That's the name of the town. You go this way for the fast route, this way to Dr. Mudd's. So he decided he better get some medical attention. Next. This is the roadway, the pathway to the Dr. Mudd home, which today is, as I say, is a very popular tourist attraction. Has anybody been to the Dr. Mudd home here? Oh, we got a couple of people have been to the Dr. Mudd home. Okay, good. This is the road to the Dr. Mudd home. Next. This is the Dr. Mudd home as it looks today. This section of the house was the kitchen, and that used to be detached. You didn't have the kitchen along with the home for fire reasons. As a boy, I played with the Mudd kids here. We rode horses, played baseball. Luckily, one of the Mudd people who lives in this area wanted to sell the land to a developer who was going to come in there and build one of these suburban type communities. And luckily, the state of Maryland stepped in. The Maryland Trust stepped in and bought all the land around the Mudd home so that it could not be turned into a Happy Hollow Farms suburban community. Next. Well, this is a modern look at the home. Today it looks very much like it did in 1865. Booth and Harold got to the Dr. Sam Mudd home at 5 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Mudd and his wife, his childhood sweetheart, his wife, Sarah Frances Dyer Mudd, said that John Wilkes, the man who had the broken leg, had a slouch hat, he had a gray shawl, he had heavy whiskers, and he let Harold do all the talking. They both said that they used names like Tyson for one and Henston or Henson for Harold. Harold called himself Henson, that they used false names. Dr. Mudd, it's early in the morning. Dr. Mudd has been ill. He's not feeling well. He helps Booth. He splints the leg. He takes the boot off. And by the way, the boot is very important here. Extremely important. They take the boot off. And they shove it under the bed upstairs where he put the splint on. And he goes back to bed for a while, as do Booth and Harold. The next morning, next slide. This is where Booth slept. Here's an 1870s, 1880s photograph. This is where Booth slept. This is where Harold slept, upstairs in the Dr. Sam Mudd home. And when Dr. Mudd went up to talk to Booth kept his back to Dr. Mudd. When Mrs. Mudd went up with food for Booth, he refused the food. All he wanted was brandy, and they didn't have any brandy. He also was very uncommunicative. And while he was at the Dr. Sam Mudd home, he shaved off his mustache. So he's in disguise mode now. And we'll get into the importance of the boot in just a little bit. So John Wilkes Booth and Davy Harold are there. Booth stays in bed. Davy Harold goes down and has breakfast with Dr. Mudd. And in late morning, early afternoon, Dr. Mudd has one of his handyman make two crutches for Booth. And Harold says, we need a wagon because Booth can't ride in a horse the way he is now. So they try to find a wagon. But the next day is Easter Sunday, and everybody's wagons are tied up. So Dr. Mudd said, well, let's go into Bryantown, which is 5 miles south of the Mudd home, and let's see if we can get a wagon. Well, almost to Bryantown, what does Harold do? Harold says, I don't think I want to go into Bryantown, because you know why? Because the soldiers were in Bryantown. And Bryantown would have heard that the president had been assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So at this particular point, Harold turns around and goes back. Now that should have been, in the back of Dr. Mudd's mind. Why did Harold turn around and go back to the house? Dr. Mudd goes in there, buys some stuff for his wife, learns that the president has been killed by a man named Booth. Now, Dr. Mudd didn't know which Booth. There's Edwin Booth, Joseph Booth, Junius Booth, John Wilkes Booth. There are 4 Booths. What Booth? And he doesn't even know if that's the same family. So Dr. Mudd, instead of rushing home when he finds out a Booth has killed Lincoln, he stops off at a neighbor's house for 15 to 20 minutes talking about some rail wood that the guy was supposed to split for him, and tells these 2 neighbors that were visiting together what a tragedy it was for the president to be assassinated at that particular time. The war is over. It's Good Friday. It's a time of resurrection. Tomorrow is Easter. And the president has been assassinated at that particular time. The first president ever to be assassinated. So Dr. Mudd as these two men said in the trial, was obviously very, very affected by the fact that the president had been assassinated. So Dr. Mudd ambles home. When he gets home, Booth and Harold are leaving. And his wife said, you know, something funny happened. When Harold was helping this other man downstairs, this Tyson or Tyser, because they sometimes got the name wrong, his heavy beard, whiskers, became detached on one side. Now that's when Dr. Mudd said, let's see, Harold turned back before we got to Bryantown, and the whiskers came loose. And now he's thinking, hey, wait a second, who are these two strange people that came to our house? Dr. Mudd at that point wants to go back to Bryantown to inform the authorities. His wife said, it's late in the day, it's after 5 o'clock, nighttime is coming, and nighttime would have been within an hour. How do you know that these two men aren't out in the bushes right there, waiting for you to step out of that door and get on your horse and gun you down? So she said, why don't you wait till tomorrow, which is going to be Easter Sunday, and tell somebody about it so they can tell the soldiers in Bryantown. And Dr. Mudd did that. But you know, he never forgave his wife. He never forgave his wife. If he had gone in right away and done that, then it would have looked okay. But to do it one day, to do it a day later, made it look as if he was giving Booth a head start. But you can see where his wife is coming from. You got your wife here, you got 4 young children here. How do you know you're not going to have them come back and destroy us all, kill us all? Next. This is a hotel in Bryantown that's still there. It's a private owner. Bryantown is about as small a town as you can get, but it's still there. And this is where the soldiers assembled, and this is where Dr. Mudd was first looked at by soldiers who came in here from the 16th New York. Next. This is the pathway that Booth and Harold took from the Mudd home into the Zakiah Swamp. That's named for the Zakiah Indians. They got lost in the swamp for 5 hours. And next. This is my father going into the swamp. A lot of moccasins. There's a quicksand. It's a bad swamp. It's not a good swamp to be running around in. Next. This is the home of a me-sort. A me-sort in Maryland, they call them me-sorts because they're me-sort this and me-sort that. They're black, they're part Indian, and this man was part Irish. So he's part Irish, he's part Indian, he's part African American. So they called them me-sorts. And this was Oswald Swan's home. Booth and Harold are lost, and they said, hey, we need help. And they knew that there was a man